Now, it also gets a little bit complex when we think about how we might apply this. Okay. So the first step when you're doing any kind of Kantian analysis is we have to think about the action that we're looking to analyze, right? So the action we have to take from a specific and turn it into something that's potentially generalizable. So we've got a simple example here, but if you're doing, say, this in your assessment or you're thinking about your application in life, you'll be thinking about taking a particular act, because that's what we're focused on this week, an act or decision. Then you have to turn it into a maxim or into a rule that anyone could follow all the time, because that's what we need to test. Okay, so that's the first step. So let's have a look. So a maxim is a statement that expresses the action we're proposing. Okay, I'll breach contracts whenever it increases my profits. Then what Kant says is we need to universalize it. So we take it from our action, we're going to breach contracts, or even I will breach this contract. Okay, well, I will breach contracts whenever it increases my profits. And Kant's going to universalize it and say everyone will breach contracts whenever it increases their profit. Okay, so that becomes the generalized rule that we need to test. We've gone from a specific, I will breach this contract or I will breach contracts to whenever it increases my profit, to saying everyone should always be able to breach contracts whenever it increases their profits. Okay. We then ask, is this rule inconsistent and contradictory? And so specifically here, you can argue, and we won't get into the damages side of it, but just pretend you had no damages. If we answered yes, if everyone breaches contracts, then contracts don't bind anyone, in which case the word of contract is meaningless, right? The whole essence of having a contract is that you can bind someone. If you're able to breach that anytime you want based upon your profitability, then the idea of a contract becomes illogical, and it breaches that idea of rationality that Kant was after. When we get this kind of illogical or inconsistent outcome, it's actually termed a contradiction in conception. Okay, the conception of what a contract is contradicted. Okay? So the concept of the contract is meaningless, and that's a contradiction. So we're not worried about the consequences of breaching a contract. We're just saying if we had this rule to follow, it's illogical and therefore it's not moral or ethical. Now, sometimes a maxim or a rule that you've developed is not a contradiction in conception, but if you did universalize it, you might not want to live in a world with that rule. Right? That's called a contradiction in will. So think about this kind of rule. I will exploit my customers in order to increase profits. Okay. So if we think about that rule, okay, there might be nothing illogical about it. There's nothing illogical about exploiting customers, and there's nothing illogical about exploiting them to increase profits. But the question is, do you want to live in a world where everyone all the time is always exploiting customers to increase profits? And most people would agree that a rational person would not want that situation. We're all customers, so we don't want to be ripped off in every transaction that we're involved in. So as well as this idea of a contradiction in conception, we have to test a maxim for contradiction in will. So let's have a brief summary of where we are. Okay. So what does Kant say we've got to do thus far? Okay, well, he's worried about us being rational. And he says a rational person will meet the categorical imperative. Well, how do we know if what we're going to do is going to meet the categorical imperative? Okay, well, take the action that you want to do. Okay. Generalize that to a rule that applies to everyone all the time. If there's a contradiction in conception, it's illogical, or a contradiction in will, it ends up in a world that you would want to live in, then it breaches his first test, right? Universality, and it's not ethical. But even if it meets that, even if it's universal, we have to go to the second stage, right? Okay, let's get into that. So as well as making sure that it's universal, we have to deal with the second test of respect. So we've got to treat humanity not simply as a means to an ends. Okay, you can treat people as a means. So if you go to get a cup of coffee, you can treat the barista as a means to getting that coffee, but you've got to deal with them with respect in that relationship as well. So it's not saying, you can't interact with people to get what you want. It's just how you do that has to treat people with respect. Okay, so you can sell to a customer. Okay, so think of it from the other way. Selling goods to a customer is fine so long as you respect their choice of buying. You don't try and force them to buy something that's not good for them. Working out respect, one of the key things to think about is that you're respecting the ability of individuals to make their own rational decisions, right? That you're not forcing them to do something. So Kant can be a little bit difficult to think through, but I think with some application, you can see more clearly how it actually applies. Look, I know some people ask, what's the third principle, right? Well, the third principle is your own moral queen or king. What does that really mean? Well, don't think that your decisions don't take into account others' morality with your decisions. Okay, so I shouldn't make a decision worried about whether that person's going to act ethically or morally. So if someone's going to murder someone, my action, I shouldn't care whether my taking the action affects that person's decision to murder, okay, because that's their decision. The morality is on them. The only morality on me is mine. I'm my own moral queen or king. Okay, so it's a bit difficult, so we will skip that. If you get the first two, that's a great way forward to understand the basic approach of Kant. There's some other resources there, and also we must remember that as within all moral or ethical frameworks, there will of course be some particular challenges or some particular problems when applying an approach, and it's the same with Kant, right? So what we can see is that if we strictly apply Kant, it becomes really difficult, and there are some situations where we start to say, geez, I'm not sure whether that thing's the moral or ethical approach. So for instance, the classic example that's always used with Kant is lying, right? Now, if we universalize lying, it's contradictory. So if you were allowed to lie, then the meaning of lying becomes irrelevant. Like lying is not telling the truth, and truth becomes meaningless if you're allowed to lie. So lying would, under a Kantian approach, would never be acceptable. Never, even if it would save someone's life. Yeah, Kant would say consequences don't matter. Okay, so that's a very strict approach, and most people looking at that go, geez, that's a bit harsh. I'm not sure that that's a good way to go. The second thing that it does, and we'll come back to this when we look at moral duties, is that you really can't resolve conflicting duties. So what happens if you have two maxims that apply? I ought not to lie, and I ought not let someone be killed, right? They both seem pretty reasonable maxims. So once they're in conflict, Kant doesn't tell us, well, which one do we do? Do we lie, or do we let someone be killed if we were in that situation? So again, like all other areas of ethics, Kant does have some positives, helps us think about the problem a different way, but there's also some problems if we apply it very strictly. Okay, so that's a big one, and it's the first of our deontological approaches. We're going to do an extension of that in the next video, looking at moral rights.